Okay, so a bit of delay on coming up with this video because I was fighting with my microphone. Unfortunately, I will be using my computer's built-in microphone, which is not what I intended to do. So the audio won't be super great. I'll try and fix that for next time. But for this video, I want to build off what we talked about last time on February 12th, and use this video as a way to put some ideas in everyone's head to consider for our next meeting on February 19th. What I want to focus on is value generation via radical creativity. This particular video will focus in particular on a necessary attribute of being able to do that, which is the continuum, and then an attribute of the continuum which is infinite. So I'll dig into that a bit this video, and of course we can discuss it. You can ask questions online, and then we'll certainly discuss it further in the lecture next week. But I'll start with the fact that I made a bit of a mistake when I was sketching out let's see if this highlighter works. Sketching out this spectrum here. I talked about the review, and then the gap, and then I put novel here, but really in a sense novel's ambiguous because novel could just be filling in a gap. But what I really want to say, what makes it sort of radical, so to speak, is generating new value, not just new facts or facts that people missed, but new value. It's normative. I mean, that's sort of I think in a lot of ways what semiotics in general brings to the table is a normative approach. But what I like to reemphasize also is that this space in here, really the space that shall not be named, so to speak, which we could provisionally call semiosis, but we need to arrive at what we mean by that. We don't want to just rest on the term and just assume that we all know what each other is talking about. So we don't want to name it a priori. We want to arrive at a meaning as we help each other sort of break our frames and our inherited frames and try and do something new. Okay, so this diagram we covered before, and we'll talk again about focusing on value this time around. And what I'll try and redescribe in this video is how it is that we want to look at this process from a lot of different perspectives, and discuss how meaning making, value generation, is the ability to in some sense find the overlap between these different perspectives, and then how that works is non-trivial. But what I definitely want to emphasize is that the approach I'm certainly stressing that I'm offering you guys throughout this course is more of a process-oriented approach. We won't talk about the sign, so to speak, until later in the course. In fact, I think the notion of a sign is very actually much more complex in a way than the process, and in that sense, starting with talking about the sign, I think, is very problematic pedagogically. Well, that's a whole nother conversation beyond the scope of this video, but we can talk about that as well. But anyway, point being is that my experience, how it is I arrived at my understanding of semiosis is through the design process, which I introduced you guys a bit last time. And long before I knew what semiotics was, I was a practicing architect, as I mentioned, and we would have a process of, so for example, these sketches, we'd move from one sketch to another sketch, and these maybe you'd have 100 sketches, but we wouldn't start the sketches unless we had engaged what it is the client wanted, the constraints, the site constraints, studied those and had all of those competing demands, opportunities, hopes in our minds, then come up with a sketch that tries to capture a singular while also simultaneously complex solution to the all the competing demands. And how it is you go from one sketch to the next is really a bit of a hard problem. Like, in other words, what's happening in the designer's mind to be able to do this? I mean, we could call it semiosis, but that kind of begs the question, like, well, what do we mean? What is the nature of this process? So, coming back to, well, I should say, sorry, uh, I mentioned this competition I entered for the World Trade Center, called it Vita di Luce, Life of Light, which I'll be able to explain why later. But it was basically an attempt to do something a bit more, well, meaningful than just designing homes. Although designing homes for the people who are having you design them, of course, it's quite meaningful for them. Um, but I was curious, as many designers are, like, to what degree can we push our design process to be even more meaningful? So here are the World Trade Center foundations, and the task was to come up with a memorial. What I had sort of done is the opposite. I don't know if any of you have been to the States, and Maya Lin's rather famous Vietnam Memorial on the mall in Washington D.C. Is basically like a cut in the ground with these black slabs that have the names of fallen soldiers on them. It's very elegant, but it's very dark. It's very well, and it's also a very traditional approach to memorialization. What I wanted to do was do something that was more well, living in quite a literal sense. That this is reminiscent. This cut in the ground is reminiscent of Maya Lin's project, but I flipped it so that the ground is the dark, and then there would be this light that would be drawing people in, and it would be active. It wouldn't be so somber. It would be an active process of remembrance. This is just to zoom in on, um, so we were standing over here, looking towards this portion of the monument. The cut is here, and then the part I want to focus on, sort of the centerpiece, if you will, is this obelisk. It was translucent obelisk, and the point of it was to take on many different like people who came by to visit, their movements, their heat signature, their sound, the sights and the sounds. All of these patterns would be absorbed by the system and be taken in by what I was calling the memory root, and the sort of the black box, if you will, of how this thing would work. But in essence, it's design intent. In other words, the criteria by which I wanted this design to be successful, so to speak, would be that this interactive design would work such that as people came by, the the memory root would remember who they are, by their pattern of, like I said, movement and sound, et cetera, et cetera. All these different modalities, like, similar to human sensory modalities. and that these would all somehow be superposed to represent um, the not only the individual, and this is really critical, but also that how that individual was set within um, the community of people that would come by, uh, and ideally that the successful the successful implementation of this design would be that people would be able to come back and not only see themselves somehow reflected in this obelisk, but see themselves set amongst other people who had also visited. So not unlike you become a friend or a lover with someone, they have a personality. And what's a personality? Well, a personality, at least in one sense, is a series of habits that you, as the person becoming friends with someone else, get used to the ways in which they respond to you, and you recognize you both, each of you recognize each other in each other's greetings and jokes. Um, but very importantly, you also recognize each other through, say, your collective friends, your families, institutions, that all the gestures and movements, like in rituals, no matter how secular, like watching sports or something like that, the jokes, the codes, the all the different kinds of codes, that you not only see each other, one on one, but you also see how it is you're both, each of you is set within a larger community. And so I was really interested in that both and how it is how it is in essence each of us is we we increase the richness of our own personality, of our own individuality, paradoxically, by engaging more people, more human institutions, nature, etc. This enriches our individuality by sort of problematizing ourselves and then dealing with that, resolving it, and enriching our personality. So the idea was is that this art piece was in essence a way to try and be a more active response to a very traumatic event where clearly people weren't seeing themselves in each other. So how could you understand and implement that capacity? But then I woke up after submitting this thing and realizing that I had no idea how this thing could work. I mean, because what I had stumbled upon really was that is this age-old philosophical conundrum between continuity and discontinuity, or the individual and collective, or the present and the not present, both physically and temporally, and in time and space. These are age-old philosophical problems of understanding self, for example, like understanding yourself set within the world, um, and it really became a problem of how to resolve what's the whether it's spatially or temporally um, distinguishable, and nevertheless, you know, um, uh, out of the continuum. We intuitively understand that there's continuity. That how is it the self is continuous over time, but clearly there's a punctuation of our lives, and we can recognize stages. We could recognize clearly we can recognize individual bodies, but then even individual aspects of ourselves, individual phases of our own lives. Um, and so I suppose the answer for me was presented through the very mundane experience of standing in my kitchen and looking at a baking dish and watching the water reflect off I had like bumped it or something, and it created like waves, these interference waves within the surface of the water, and the sunlight was streaming in and then bouncing off these waves and then reflecting up off the wall, and I was just mesmerized for a moment. This isn't my exact wall, but I thought this was a really, really beautiful, probably much more beautiful than what it is I saw. But the superposition um, of countless patterns that that were superposing on themselves, and I sort of the aha moment was that I realized that um, that there could be an infinite number of patterns, not just in principle, but like actually, like noise. When you study noise, you realize that noise, whether it's in air or water or that it really is an infinite number of superposed signals, and it's exactly because there's so many that it drowns out signal. Um, and so I was really enamored with this reflection on the wall because, in a sense, the reflection itself was so simplified, right? It's this two-dimensional, quite alluring tapestry, if you will, pattern. And I realized that there could be absolutely an infinite number of patterns on that wall. But I also realized that 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 insofar it was this baking dish, right? It was this very confined, constrained, um, uh, um, you know, artifact, and that the waves were confined. That I realized that you could have this infinity in a finite space. And then, went down all sorts of rabbit holes and realized, you'll discovered that, mathematically, this is something called transfinite. In other words, it's something that Gregor Cantor made a distinction, and as I'll discuss later, Peirce also intuited this aspect of reality, that you can have infinite numbers of patterns within a very finite space. So we can talk about that more. We could look at that from a lot of different angles. But what I want to highlight right now is the importance of, like, these drops of water on the pond, that you can simultaneously distinguish the distinct drops, but also appreciate the interference pattern that they share, that they co-create. And interestingly, that if you just took a single drop, it would just be these concentric circles. It would just be really quite simple, and you could characterize it mathematically, and it would be relatively straightforward series of sequential concentric circles. But as soon as you superpose, say, two or three or arbitrarily many of these drops, the interference pattern becomes arbitrarily complex. Um, and then the sort of the amazing thing is that that this complexity, like, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the continuity. It necessitates the fact that the surface of water, the actual physical surface of water, is continuous. And these degrees of freedom, so to speak, in sort of technical and mathematical speak or systems theoretic speak, all it means is that you could have arbitrarily many drops of water, wind or sound or whatever, that perturbs the surface of water, and those patterns will superpose with all the other patterns, to become one immediate, simultaneous, arbitrarily complex pattern, and that all the so-called dimensions that you would need to characterize that pattern, are available in that continuous medium, without any extra work or energy or power or intent. They're just available, just available. So this, one of the first inspirations for this course was actually this idea of things in fiction, for example, that are bigger on the inside than they are on the outside. This is just one of many examples. This is one of them that came to mind. Um, the TARDIS from the Doctor Who science fiction series, and that, just sort of tongue in cheek, it's this, police box, this, UK style police box, on the outside, which is clearly very finite. But then you go inside and it's arbitrarily large. And this is like, oh well, this is just a total like fantasy, right? And of course, I mean for the show it is, but I mean like I was leading up to in the previous couple slides, it's not that crazy. And then I began to think about, well, hey, like look at all the different iterations of the Doctor Who show having different interiors. And not only that, there's one of the websites was talking about how every single instance of the police box, number one, never matched an actual authentic police box in the UK, and that they were each different. They were just each different in their own way. So that not only is there an infinite number of iterations of the outside, there's an infinite number of possible iterations on the inside. And again, the question is, how is this possible? Well, one answer is well the human imagination, right? Because we have a finite frame here, our skull, and nevertheless our brain is able to generate arbitrarily many, arguably transfinite quantities of stories uh, and well signs, as we'll come to through the course. Um, so really, one of the main things I'm doing with this course and with my own work is kind of inverting the frame. So typically, models of, well, any model for that matter, scientific model or semiotic model, sociological model, they'll start with the relata. They'll start with what's being related. You see the diagrams all the time. You see the nodes, and then you have these lines, between the nodes, and saying, okay, this node is, say, a person or some sort of abstract computational element, and then it affects this other node in a very, organized and predetermined way. And so that all of these, not only are the relata, the nodes in this case, presupposed, but also how they relate is largely presupposed. So all I'm suggesting here is to invert the frame and to ask ourselves how it is that we can conceive the relata emerging from the noise of the relations, like the actual sort of physical relations. In this case, the metaphor that I've been using, or the analogy really, is the interference pattern on the surface of water, so that we don't preconceive the relata to then frame the relations, right? So, because as a human habit, at least in this day and age, we typically preconceive the relata, and then that frames the relations, but that already kills everything that I've just talked about in terms of the capacity, the transfinite capacity to realize to allow this idea of the art of letting it become, if you will. How do we let relata become? Like, where did the relata come from? I mean, it's just a classic sort of fallacy of like begging the question. We sort of just assumed the relata and didn't ask where they came from. And arguably, as I have been arguing, will continue to, it, to do this inversion is to highlight the necessity of the continuum. Okay, so I'm not going to read these quotes. I'll let you pause and read these quotes at your leisure, because it'd be a bit monotonous for me to read them. But what I want to do is highlight a couple things. First of all, this is a pull quote from Lotman, and these are all quotes from Peirce. And as you can see, these quick highlights, they're both talking about continuity. So at a super high level, sort of the methodology of the course, the methodology of semiotics, if you will, for myself, what I want to try and impart onto you guys is the capacity to see how different researchers from their own direction are looking at a concept, say like continuity or the continuum, and as a way to shore up your thesis. It could also be a way to discover your thesis. You don't have to like in the spirit of what I've just been talking about, you don't have to presuppose your thesis. You could also just do some back and forth between, say, Hoffmeyer, Peirce, Barth, Lotman, whoever, von School, sort of rattling off more biosemiotic folks. But you have your own folks like that you like to just you prefer, and you look at them, and then you look at read some of your other favorite passages, and then maybe a third, and you just hold those in your mind, and what rises to the fore, like what do you notice that might answer some of your questions about semiotics, for example, or semiosis more generally. So that's again this sort of resolving the blind men and the elephant methodology. But what's interesting in this particular case for my own example of doing this is how it is each author is talking about the continuum. Um, we will certainly talk more about how it is they approach this very powerful concept, um, both similarly but also differently. Um, and uh, what popped out at me in going through some of these quotes is this down here, infinitesimal duration, which in a sense is a contradiction, right? Because it's like, how do you have a it's almost like saying like there's an instantaneous duration, which is a bit of a contradiction. But as you read what Peirce is saying here, and then I believe what he says after this, which I'll post as part of the reading tomorrow, probably on Sunday, um, is how it is that there's this very careful balance between distinct aspects of a continuum, so that you have both the distinguishable and the emerging out of the indistinguishable, but you need the indistinguishable, and that indistinguishable would be the continuum. And in this sort of paradoxical phrase, Peirce is kind of highlighting how, well, I will use another metaphor of quantum mechanics. Um, don't panic. This one I'll walk through a little bit. Um, but the idea is that you could think of all these waves as like the ripples on the water. So imagine that what we're looking at here on this one is we're taking a section through, like, say, a surface of water, and that these are all individual little perturbations. Like, you had a certain frequency, a bunch of different frequencies of perturbations, like whether it's wind or a sound or um, uh, yeah, any number of perturbations, each with their own frequencies, superposing, so they all simultaneously. Um, Here's a sort of a less crazy example. Like, these are all superposing to realize, it's hard to tell, but this one here is important to. This is the summation. This is the superposition of all the other waves. And similarly, here's all the superposed waves, and then here, boop, 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 is the summation. So this is what you would observe if you you had all these waves superposed on water or in air. Um, so on water, you might be able to just see this constructive interference here, because it would be an actual wave that would actually do this. You would definitely notice this. It would be weird if you saw this in water, but it's totally possible. Um, uh, in sound, for example, this might be what's called a beat frequency. So when you have a certain relationship between different frequencies, when you have, say, 40 hertz and then 41 hertz, and those two different sine waves are superposed, what you audibly hear is, in addition to the two sort of competing 40 and 41 hertz, is a 1 hertz beat frequency. And it's because of the constructive interference of where it is those two waves that are very close to each other, where it is they add up the strongest. It's called constructive interference. Um, So quantum mechanics is basically built upon this idea, and we can dig into that as much as you guys want to. But the basic idea that I want to really emphasize here is that this is essentially a reasonable solution to the conundrum of continuity versus discontinuity. You have these continuous distributed waves that all superpose, and it's the relationship between each of these superposed waves that then generates these sort of punctuated moments, if you will. Um, and it's these punctuated moments that we might perceive. But just because we only perceive these punctuated moments, and we say, oh well, these are discrete. Like this one is discrete from this one based on my limited understanding of the entire system, when in fact what's actually creating these seemingly very localized phenomena is a fundamentally distributed continuum, and it's just the relationship between the attributes of the aspects of that continuum that generates a very particular pattern, perceivable pattern. I like to think, I mean, this might be pushing Lotman quite a bit, but I really like to think uh, of these as kind of subtext, if you will, and then what we're able to perceive and create is text, and that these texts we could point to the text and say, well, that's actual, those are actual things, and they actually have a time and place in the world, but not unlike this sort of original desire to understand each other through our, understand ourselves, um, at our own self, our own individuality, as actually kind of in a way these superpositions, that we're just very complex superpositions of all sorts of both physical and cultural, socio-cultural dynamics, perturbations, patterns, um, that we are sort of the superposed constructive result, as arguably our texts, Lotmanian texts, result of all that noise, so to speak. Okay, so just wrapping up a couple more slides here. So given all that, I just want to circle back to our metaphor, the blind monks, and how it is that in order to collectively better understand ourselves, better understand the world. As I was saying before, there's kind of a sweet spot, if you will, in balancing um, overly cohering on like a singular perspective on the question at hand, and then under cohering. Um, so now, given what I've talked about so far, can talk about undercohering being just the noise, so to speak, just that band, like in the previous slide, um, of all of the different superposed wave patterns that deconstructively interfere, and that you don't notice. But then every now and again you get that punctuation; those are coherences, that constructive interference. And then overcoherence would be when you're just too salient, that you don't, that how to put this, like you just have, there's just one actuality to rule them all, and then that dominance then precludes the ability for multiple different sort of measurements, if you will, of what's happening in the field. The more and more, in a sense, the more and more all those infinite number of possible superposed waves happen to cohere in a way that they just generate one signal, then it gives us the wrong impression that then represents all the potential of all those underlying dynamics. So, for example, it would be like one blind man, looking at the leg, saying, and because for whatever reason they're able to dominate all the other perspectives, all the other potential, waves, subtext, then everyone just assumes that the elephant is equivalent to a tree trunk. Um, what I'd like to do is another sort of mistake I made is I prefer not to say spot, and I definitely prefer not to claim that undercoherence and overcoherence are actually also like these fixed points. That's actually a mistake. What I really want to say is that undercoherence is a tendency and overcoherence is like a contradictory tendency, but again, re-emphasizing Lotman's notion that translatability and untranslatability coexist simultaneously, um, that these tendencies have to coexist in tension with each other, and that there's a sweet zone. I don't want to even say spot because that gives the impression that there's like that we could optimize for, that we can maximize for this balance. And for various reasons that are beyond the time I have now, that's just not viable for semiosis and arguably for life in general. Definitely, we'll talk about that more as we go along. Um, but yeah, I'll just conclude coming back to this diagram, and talk about value generation, or the art of letting it become via coherence of diverse perspectives by decohering each just enough, like squinting one's mind, blurring the one to see the constructive interference among the many. So this is just again kind of building off or highlighting the paradox of being, both cohering and decohering, both translating and untranslating. That you need to sort of, in order for each blind monk to to be open to another blind monk, they have to kind of desemiotize themselves a little bit. They have to kind of unframe themselves. They have to kind of deterritorialize themselves just enough, not too much, right? Because then that's undercoherence. To but enough to be able to be open to the overlaps, and to discover them. All right, thanks a lot. Look for the questions in Moodle, and I look forward to further discussion.